I'm Juliana Gomez. I'm a web engineer at Huge in Medellin, Colombia. I actually used to work in marketing for a really long time, and then bitten by the programming bug, I was like, I have to learn to do this. I want to do what everyone else does. So I learned to program, and it's been a short time. It's been almost 2 years for me, and it's been a really great journey. I've included my Twitter handle on all the slides in the top right-hand corner. As well, I've got the slides at this link. It's goo.goo.gl/F XRP6. If you want to follow along, they're all there. Given the topic, I tried to make this presentation as accessible as possible. So if you feel more comfortable following along, they're PDF there. I'll also take this time. Does anybody need me to describe the images on my slides? Awesome. That's a trick I learned from Nick. Thanks, Nick. All right, so today I want to talk to you about web accessibility. And there have already been so many great talks this conference about web accessibility. Did you guys get to catch Scott Davis yesterday? Amazing. That guy's an amazing speaker. Oh, loved it. I want to build on top of that. I think a lot of us here have heard and know about the importance of accessibility. The fact that you showed up to this talk probably means that you care about it and that you want to do it in your own work. But I think the way that we talk about accessibility sometimes is really scary. We talk about, oh, that's a nightmare. Oh, that's really hard to do. So I want to give you guys today some tools and techniques that you can use to implement basic, simple accessibility. Keep in mind, I'm a beginner, so that we can start making the world a better place. Accessibility, I think, has a lot to do. Yes, it's a very technical topic, but it's also one that touches us, like right in our feels, you know? For me, accessibility has become the thread that ties together my life as a web developer with my ethics of creating spaces for everyone to thrive in. So with that said, let's do a little recap about why accessibility, or what it is, why we do it. So everyone defines accessibility differently, I think. This is my personal definition so far. It's the process of making our sites, apps, products available to folks with varying levels of disability, whether that's permanent or situational, on various devices in various situations. So when we talk about accessibility, we often mention that 20%, according to the WebAIM, one of the leading accessibility experts worldwide, almost 20% of the world's population lives with a disability of some kind. Now, that's not to say that 20% of the world's population can't use the internet the same way that you and I do, but it is, I think, unwise, and more than that, unkind, to exclude these people from this world that's given us so many opportunities, opened so many doors for us, this world that lets us make new friends when we're lonely, and lets us find out what that weird thing on my toenail was, or lets us change careers. It was weird, guys. I think in the script it said that weird thing on our toenail, so but anyways, for me anyways, and for a lot of people, it's helped us learn stuff and change careers and all this freedom that comes with that. So I think it's very important, and I think a lot of people would agree. I want you to take a moment and think if you or someone you know lives with a disability of some kind, and I want you to raise your hand. Could be a friend, a neighbor, brother, sister. Cool. Now keep them up there. And everyone take a look around and see how many people raise their hand. It affects a lot of us. Thanks a lot. Now, when we talk about disabilities, we talk about different types of disabilities that can be categorized into 4 categories. The first one is visual. So this includes blindness, color blindness, and low vision. The second one is hearing. So deafness and hard of hearing. The third one is motor. So it includes the inability to use a mouse, slow or limited motor control, things like that. And the fourth one is cognitive. Now, cognitive is really broad. We're talking about learning disabilities. It could be a brain injury. It could be distractibility. It could be a slow response time, things like that. And the really great thing about accessibility picking up a lot of traction in the web community is that there's a lot of tools, resources, organizations, people that are working to give us, to make it easier to implement and to make it easier to have it top of mind. One of these is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines were created by the W3C, which is a vendor-neutral group that supplies the standards and protocols for the web. And with their Web Accessibility Initiative, they've created WCAG. So WCAG are the set of guidelines that you can use when you're creating content for online consumption that can keep you, I guess, considering the different things that would impact the usability of your products. So that it's divided into 4 categories too. So the first category is perceivable. So this one always sounds really funny when I say it, but to make your things perceivable, it means that somebody, your users, need to be able to input the information into their brain so they can process it. And if they can't do this, then that's not accessible. The second is operable. So it means that your users need to be able to find, navigate, and use your content. The third is understandable. So it means they need to understand both your content, so what it means, why'd you write it, what is it good for. And the other side of understandable is that they understand how to use it, what does it do, things like that. And the fourth consideration is robust. So robust covers a lot of things, and it's a lot of things that actually make usability really interesting. So robust is, does it break often? Can I use it under different speeds, so performance? We're talking here about cross-navigation, cross-browser navigation. Can I use it in EI? Can I use it in different browsers? Like Nick said in his amazing tutorial, there's a lot of folks with assistive technologies that haven't been updated, so they need to stick to older browsers or older technologies so that they can still use their assistive technologies. And the last thing that we think about too under robust is responsive. Can I use it in different devices, in different orientations? Will it still work? Now, WCAG follows 3 basic levels. And as we go into these examples, I want you to have a solid idea in your mind of what you would follow in these 3 levels. So raise your hand if you have or you think it'd be a good idea to include a video on a website. All right. You guys are shy. Videos are great. I used to work in communications. They communicate very well. All right, so you want to have a video on your website. And what would you need to do? So if you want to follow WCAG level A, you'd have to include captions for your videos. Now, level A is the lowest level. And then every level on top of that builds on top. So if you want to follow level double A, you have to include everything from level A and then add on top of it in your considerations. So for our video example, if you wanted to follow double A, you'd have to provide captions for live audio content. So if you're streaming or something, there's a lot of really great caption services that are popping up that are live captions. That's going to be super exciting for that one. And the third level is triple A. So it includes everything from A, everything from double A, and then you add on top of that. So in this case, you'd have sign language interpretation for pre-recorded material. Now, it's important to clarify here that WCAG takes into consideration your entire site. You can't just say, oh, but this little part is accessible if the rest isn't. Or vice versa. Everything's accessible except this little part. You have to make everything accessible if you want to comply with WCAG. And the other thing is that just because you comply with WCAG doesn't mean your site or your app or whatever you're making is going to be 100% accessible. In fact, you really need to have an open channel of communications with your users, be willing to listen to them, be willing to change things, adapt things for the way that they're using it. Because in the end, Accessibility is an ongoing process that will always need to have its space in your development process, from the very beginning to the very end, and right when you iterate every time. So now that we know that accessibility is important, you might be standing here and you'll say like, all right, Jules, but what do you do? And I will tell you after I take this sip of water. So I did want you to leave here today with some techniques, implementations, and I wanted to tackle things that people say are common everyday elements that are accessibility nightmares. People love that term, accessibility nightmares. I think I do too, I've said it so much now. But to do this, I want to tell you a story. So I want you to meet Taylor. Taylor is a front-end developer like you and like me. They're super cute. And they have a little sister that lives with a disability. That means she can't use the internet the same way that we normally do. So raise your hand again if you raised it just a minute ago and I asked if you or someone you know lives with a disability. Yeah, take a look around. These are all Taylor's little sisters. It's important for all of us. It's important for a majority of us. And so Taylor wanted to include their little sister in on this world that had opened so many doors for them. So they wanted to create a project that was WCAG compliant, that used HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I tried, it didn't work. So developers on the internet said, it's too hard and it's complicated. Accessibility costs a lot of money and it's a perfectly valid observation that one can skimp on it for profit. Or, when I think of accessibility, all I can think about is a bunch more work that may or may not be worth it. And this discouraged Taylor. It discourages all of us to do this work. But Taylor thought and thought and thought of their little sister, and they said, you know what? I want to make a difference for these folks. So, armed with the resource pages from this presentation and the web content accessibility guidelines, plug, Taylor set off to create their app. And they planned, they iterated, they designed it. This was their little baby from the beginning. So they made sure that everything was accessible. And everything was going on well. Taylor was using buttons instead of divs. They were using appropriate alt text. Because they designed it, they made sure that they had proper color contrast, that their designs were up to spec, everything was going well. And because Taylor had an effective roadmap, they knew their first accessibility nightmare was coming up. And it was a custom form. So forms are really important to make accessible because they're the way that we sign up for things, they're the way that we buy things, that we ship things to ourselves. So it's really important that Taylor made their form accessible. So the first thing that they did was to use labels properly. By properly labeling everything, your users will know what it is that you want them to do, normally what it's for, and maybe some instructions for it. So the easiest way to create labels is to use a label element, and then with your input, provide in the for attribute for the label, provide the ID of the input that it links to. Super easy. Then, when Taylor had their labels done, they moved on, but they noticed that they had some labels that were explicit enough to communicate what they were for, some inputs that were explicit enough to communicate what they were for, so they didn't need to have a visual label. But they didn't want to hide the label from assistive technologies, so they had 4 options. The first option is to hide it with CSS. So here we've got a label with a class of visually hidden, and then in the style, in the CSS file, you basically just take everything out. And this is really good because it's going to hide it from the visual representation, but it's not going to hide it from the DOM or the accessibility tree. So assistive technologies will still be able to use it. The second option is to use an ARIA label. So an ARIA label works by putting a string in the label that you wanted to read. So in this case, it would read search. The third option is to use an area labeled by, which is similar, but it works again with IDs. So you point it to an element that you wanted to read. In this case, it's pointing to this button that has the same ID as the ARIA labeled. And the last one is to use a title attribute. Title is a tricky recommendation because it shows up for some screen readers, it doesn't show up for others, but it does have this handy tooltip when you hover over it. So there's a lot of considerations there. In their case, Taylor decided to hide it with CSS because, as we learned, the first rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA. So then Taylor kept on their work, they were coding, they were having a blast, and they noticed that they had some labels that were generated dynamically. So they wondered what to do with that. They weren't sure how to get the ID that didn't exist yet to put in their label. All of this led them to implicit labels. So implicit labels is where you grab the input and the label that you'd hope to have, and you put it all inside the label. This is a bit tricky. Sometimes screen readers will pick it up, sometimes not. But if your labels are generated dynamically or you have a similar scenario, this is a practice that you can rely on that's at least a little helpful. And then Taylor wanted to create some buttons for their form. They needed to have a submit, they needed to have a send, they needed to have an OK. So there's two ways you can make buttons. You can use a button element, and then this will take the label from whatever text is inside the button. Or you can use an input that you then style as a button, and this would take the label from the value that you submit to it. With their labels done, Taylor moved on to their next challenge. So grouping common elements together. It's important in forums that you group common elements together so that folks know, can kind of have that pattern recognition of, oh, these things go together, I should pay attention to them as a group. This is one of the things that we can do to help people with cognitive disabilities or people who are just having like a rough day, and they're tired. So in the first scenario, Taylor had this checkbox, and they wanted to communicate that all these options were for the same thing. So you can use a field set element, and you basically just stick everything in there in the field set element, close it up, and then you use a legend element to give the title to that little group of options. You can do the same thing with a div with the role set to group, and this is a little bit easier for styling. You have a little bit more customization. Then Taylor noticed that they had a select with a lot of different options, and they wanted to group some of those options together. And they remembered that they could use an opt group element, which works like this. You have your select, you have your options as per usual, and then your opt group element has a label, and that labels whatever you want that little group to have. And this works really well with assistive technologies. It communicates that. It also gives that visual distinction that you can see there. And it's another option that we have. And then finally, Taylor had to include instructions on their form. Now, instructions are important because it means that your users will know what to do. So Taylor included as much instructions at the beginning of the form because they'd been previously warned about screen reader form mode. So legend has it that screen readers get to, when they hit a form element, they kind of like switch modes and they don't read everything. They only read form elements. So like inputs, buttons, labels, selects. And the worst part is that it's true. This is actually how screen readers work. But once you know that, you can work around it. So instructions at the top of the form so that your screen reader will read it completely, and then in line as the form goes on. So the easiest way to do it, 5 out of 5, highly recommend. is to put your instructions inside the label. So here in this label, we're asking for an expiration date, and we're putting in parentheses the format that we want that date to be provided in. The second way that you could do it is with an aria labeled by, which we've already mentioned. It takes an ID. In this case, it's actually taking 2 IDs, which it can do. Or you can use an aria described by, which is very similar. It also takes IDs. The only difference is that aria described by is available to users upon request. Taylor was almost done with their form, but they noticed one last thing, and that's placeholder text. So placeholder text in browsers natively has a very, very low color contrast, which can be super confusing for some people. Some people might not be able to read it. Maybe it's sunny. Who knows? So Taylor popped into their CSS, and they changed that color contrast to bring it up. And with that, they were done. Taylor had finished their forms. They were quite accessible. And because they are a good developer, they put away their work, and they went to rest, as we all should. Then the next day, Taylor had their next accessibility challenge. It was a date picker. Now, date pickers are commonly like, oh my God, no, it's the worst, you can't do it. But they can be important. And someone asked Taylor just that, like, yo, do you really need that? And it's a good question. You should be including elements in your application because it makes sense, because it'll help your users, because it has a purpose, not just because you saw it on a competitor's website, or because you think it looks cool, or because your friend told you to do it. So for Taylor, they did have a purpose. But, and then someone else also told them, like, why don't you just hide it from screen readers so you don't have to do it? Which is actually a very mean thing to do. The point of accessibility work is that we can all have an equal or equitable experience. So just hiding elements from screen readers is just mean. Just don't do it. Taylor decided to do it, but they decided to include an input at the top as well, so that if someone doesn't want to use a date picker, they don't have to. They can just put in the date, and everything will work fine. But they decided to include the date picker. So the first thing they did was to use semantic HTML. Semantic HTML is very important because it lets your users, it lets technologies that already exist create experiences for assistive technologies that you don't even have to think about or worry about. There is so much accessibility baked into HTML5 elements that it's best if we can stick to them. It's best if we can use them appropriately. So this is a date picker, and it's using divs, but inside the divs it's using buttons, it's using appropriate headers, it's got labels for the buttons, so here it's an aria label. An important thing too to include with date pickers is I recommend coding the buttons for each individual day as buttons, and then adding aria labels in to include to read out both the day of the week, three things, the day of the week, the month, and the day. Because this is what we really get from a calendar when we look at it visually. We get that representation of like, oh, this day is a Saturday, this day is a Tuesday. So you want to include an equal experience for folks using assistive technologies, and this is one of the ways we can do that. And then Taylor moved on to the scarier thing, adding keyboard navigation. Now, keyword navigation is really important in the things that we make because assistive technologies tend to mimic keyboard interactions. So when we have event listeners on keys, when we have things accessible via keyboard, it means that users can tailor their technologies to use yours. So making a date picker accessible is a bit challenging, but it's not impossible. This is the way that I've done it. I'm sure there's a lot of other ways to do it. So I created this date picker, and it's got two like container elements. The first is the class date picker, so it goes around the entire date picker. And the second is with a class calendar, and that's just the days. And I recommend putting the event listener on the calendar container, because it avoids a lot of event bubbling if you put it on every single element. And then in the constructor, creating a state to keep track of the weekday, the day, the month, the year, and the current selection. And this becomes important when you're using that to create new dates. So as I mentioned, the event listener is on that calendar div. And when it fires off, it goes to this giant code snippet now that I see it on a big slide. But I'll walk you through it. It's OK. So it goes to this. The first thing it does, it just checks if there's already a current selection. It takes off a class that highlights that. And then it listens for arrow left, arrow right, arrow up, and arrow down. And it refers them to a helper function called change date, and it passes it 2 parameters. So I'll give you a second to digest this. Yeah.
Since you're focusing whatever the current selection is, what's the benefit of adding a selected class instead of styling the focus and hover states?
It's a good. Well, I mean, there's a lot of ways to do it that works as well.
Are you using that for anything else besides those styles?
No, I didn't even think of focus elements when I did it, but it's another way to do it, yeah. So then this is the helper function that it goes to. It takes 2 parameters. It takes the operation and the amount. So here I've named them type and amount. And the first thing that you do is you create some date elements. When I was doing this, I learned you can do math on date elements. So you don't need to get tied up on if it's going to change months, how many days are in the new month, subtracting how many days are still in this month, and it's just a bunch of math that nobody wants to do. So you can create some date objects and then do the math on that. And the math there is like line 66 to 70. It's looking at what the operation is, so if we're adding or if we're subtracting, and it's subtracting the amount. So the amount refers to if you go left or right, you're going to add or subtract by 1. And if you go up and down, you're going to add or subtract by 7. And then after that, we create a new date. We change the state. And then we check to see if there's a new month. And if there's a new month, we paint a new calendar. I'll give you a second to digest this one, too. Great. Taylor created their own date picker, and I as well. But you don't have to. There's a new date picker. Type in inputs, and this will make native elements are the best. Use them whenever you can. This one's not ready yet. It's still it's not adopted fully by all browsers, so we're still waiting a bit to get that going. But when it is, it's going to be great. It's going to be this date picker. This is the styles that it comes out at with Chrome. But it has min and max attributes, so you can limit your date picker. And it's got a change and a change input event, so you can listen to that with JavaScript. And finally, Taylor had their last element, and it was modals. Now, modals are commonly referred to as the boss battle of accessibility. And they do have a lot of things to consider. But Taylor thought about how modals help us sign up for things, share things, buy things. It's a really integral part to internet experiences. So they knew they wanted to make it accessible. The first thing they did was to use semantic HTML. What a surprise. So they used divs for the actual modal, but all the elements inside were proper semantic elements. For example, this button, which you should always include a button to close your modals. This button is a button, and it's labeled with an ARIA label so that assistive technology will pick that up. Then they check their focus states. So a lot of people CSS resets actually erase focus states, so it's really important to include them back in. The third thing was to return the focus. So Taylor noticed that when they closed their modal, the browser returned the focus right back to the top of the page, even if the modal was open near the middle, near the end. So it's really important to save that last element, which you can do. This is an example of how you can do it. You can save that last element, and when the modal opens, put the last active element into that variable that you created, and when the modal closes, just put the focus back on that. With this in mind, Taylor realized that they needed to shift the focus as well. When the modal opened, you want to have your focus on your modal or on the first active element in the modal so that your users know what's happening, can identify the change. So this one's super easy too. We've got a variable grabbing the modal, and when your modal opens, you put the focus on that. The other thing Taylor wanted to do was to restrict the interaction. So this means that when your modal's open, your users can't tab on things behind it. They can't get lost in the content that they're not seeing. They're just focusing on that modal part that they're looking at. So if your modal's at the top of the DOM, this is the easiest way to do it so that you can restrict the interaction on everything else, and then you can still access, and then your users can still access their browser's controls. So if they want to leave your page or they want to do something else, they still can. So this is a quick little function here that I grabbed from a Smashing Magazine article. They have an event listener on focus, and if the modal's open, and if you click outside the modal, it's going to stay in the modal. If your modal's not at the top of the DOM, you can move it there. So this is a quick function swap that swaps the parent node using an insert before. And if you really can't do that, then you can create a feedback loop between the first element and the last element. But this is a trap. You're trapping your users in your modal. So you need to let them escape. You need to include an event listener on your modal. So for the escape key, which is such a common pattern now, we really need to keep that there. Taylor had two last things for their modals. They needed to assign roles. So if you assign a role, a screen reader will be able to pick up what that is. The most common ones for modals are dialog and alert dialog. Dialog is if you need user interaction or confirmation, and alert dialog, guess what it's for? It's like for alerts. And the last thing is to use labels. So you can label your container div either with an ARIA label or an ARIA labeled by, so that your users with assistive technologies can be communicated what that modal is for. And similarly to day pickers, they're working on an HTML5 element for dialogues. And this will actually be really amazing. It's going to have all that accessibility baked into the element that elements tend to have. As well, it's going to have methods. So it's going to have methods for show modal, and close that we can use with JavaScript. And it's going to have an open attribute that you can set to true or false. This is going to help avoid all the hiddens that we've used in the world. And the last thing, it's going to have this sweet backdrop pseudo element so that you can style the elements behind your modal, and you don't have to create like those div sandwiches that's like wrapper for the wrapper for the. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. So with that, Taylor was done. They had some more work to do. They worked on it on the side, blah, blah, blah. But they created this app that was accessible, that people could perceive, that they could operate, that they could understand, and that they could access. And they were super happy with their work. And you might say, all right, Jules, but that's just 3 things. What about for the rest? For the rest, I recommend WebAIM's 12 Principles of Accessible Design. So if you study these, you live up to them, create some beautiful poster on your wall, it's going to help you create really accessible experiences for a lot of people. And keep in mind what considerations you should have. So the first is to provide appropriate alternative text. So you want to provide alternative text for any non-HTML elements. There's a little bit of debate, I think, in what you should do. Should you describe the thing? Should you give context for it? I've learned with accessibility, the best answer is always, it depends. Study your users, think about what would help them more, try to really empathize with them. The second is to provide appropriate document structure. So I've said it many times today, semantic HTML is your best friend. The third is to provide headers for data tables. So luckily we don't need tables anymore for layouts. So make sure you're using them for data, make sure you're connecting the appropriate cells with the appropriate headers. The fourth is to ensure your users can complete and submit all forms. So label them properly, make sure they can submit them, and if they make any errors, make sure that they can correct them. 5, make sure links make sense out of context. So users with assistive technologies tend to browse the web differently than we do, and one of the ways that they can do is they can just read all the links in a page. And so if your links just say things like, click here, or this article, they're not going to know what you're talking about. Number 6 is to make sure you caption or provide transcripts for media. 7 is to ensure accessibility of non-HTML content. So if you're linking to a PDF, a slides doc, a Word doc, things like that, make sure you either give an accessible alternative or that it is already accessible. Number 8, allow users to skip repetitive elements on the page. Number 9, to not rely on color alone to convey meaning. Number 10, make sure content is written clearly and easy to use. So use clear fonts, make sure your copywriting team is using language that's easy to understand. And again, use headers, structured lists, things like that that help users identify the order or the meaning of things on a page. 11 is to make JavaScript accessible. So if you have any events that are dependent on devices, try to make them as device independent as you can, or keyboard as a backup. And number 12, design to standards. Things that we've been learning, things like, hey, we should separate our HTML from our CSS. All these things make us better, and it improves accessibility in a lot of different ways. So be willing to learn, be willing to grow. It's a field that's going to be changing. It's a field that's really user dependent. So be willing to keep learning. I've attached some resources here. The link is goo.gl/UWW8OR. If you want to check it out, it includes everything I've touched on for my presentation. I've included links to learn how to use screen readers. I can't stress it enough, accessibility is not just about screen readers, but screen readers is a big part of accessibility. There's a link to a free Udacity course that is amazing. It's seriously really great. And because it's such a growing field, I've attached this really large list of people to follow on Twitter. Through them, I've learned so much. We even have folks here from this very conference on that list. This is just a taste of how we can implement accessibility in our everyday projects. And I want you to know that it matters and that you're not alone. You don't have to make all these things from scratch. There's a lot of open source projects that you can plug into, that you can modify, that you can contribute to. There's a lot of us that have made this commitment to accessibility, and they're always here to help. We're always here to help. Because for a lot of us that practice accessibility, it comes down to the moral importance of it. The Webbing just did this survey on people who practice accessibility, and the majority of respondents responded that they do it because we feel a moral and an ethical inclination to do it. So we can remember there's 20% of people living with disabilities. We can remember all the people that raised their hands when we asked if you or someone you know lives with a disability. And we can see that it makes a really big difference. At the end of the day, accessibility is about humans. It's about helping people reach these resources, which should be universal, that's helped us connect, that's helped us learn things, that's helped us find information, that's helped us change our worlds. The internet is this great resource, and the really wonderful thing about being developers, being programmers, being involved in the tech industry is that it's in our hands to make this accessible for every single person on this planet. That's it for me. If you have any questions, I'll be out in the hallway or somewhere. You can find me. You can also tweet me at GMZ Juliana. Thanks so much, everyone.